Hello, everyone. Welcome. So my name is Ingrid Kongraven, and I'm from the Association for Heterodox Economics, and I'm here with Sirisha Naidu from URPE, Union for Radical Political Economy, and we're co-chairing this session. So this webinar is the first in this year's AHE webinar series, which focuses on interrogating what heterodox economics can contribute to understanding and approaching contemporary problems. So we have webinars coming up on labor and debt later this year. And these webinars are all organized by the webinar group within AHE that consists of Farwa Sial, Santiago Gan, and myself. And in this summer, we also have our annual conference in Bristol in July, for which you can still submit a paper until March 1st. So I think Devika will put the call for papers in the chat here in a moment, so watch out for that. So we wanted to start this year webinar series with the political economy of Palestine, interrogating both how heterodox economists can contribute to understanding the occupation and the genocide, and ultimately to resisting it, and also what challenges for heterodox economics that Palestine brings. So AHE published a statement in solidarity with Palestine and Palestinians last year, as we, as an association, as a community, consider it central for heterodox economists to challenge unequal power relations along all structural lines, including those that lead to the oppression of Palestinians. So there we affirm that we stand firmly with against the war crimes and genocide being committed by Israel right now. And we also recognize with the Palestinian higher education institutions that it's crucial to place these crimes within the wider framework of historical occupation of Palestine and the blockade on Gaza, which have long denied Palestinians national and political rights, including the right to exist, resist, return, and the right to self-determination. So it's very encouraging that there's a huge interest in this webinar and this topic. So as a quick housekeeping rule, just keep yourself on mute for now. And you'll have the opportunity to raise your hand, and when we'll open up for the Q&A in a moment after the speaker and the discussants have spoken. And you can feel free to put your questions in the chat at any time. We're recording this initial intervention, but we'll stop the recording before the Q&A so you can feel comfortable asking your questions. We're very happy and proud to co-badge this webinar with URPE, which is one of the few other big heterodox institutions that we know that has taken a very strong stance on Palestine. So with this, I'll pass on to Sirisha to introduce URPE and this webinar and the lineup of fantastic speakers.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. And thank you to AHE, Ingrid, and all the organizers who put this fantastic panel together. This is such an important moment. As Ingrid mentioned, URPE took a very strong stand on Palestine, and URPE as an organization, and URPE stands for Union of Radical Political Economics, and it, as an organization, was founded in 1968 as a response to the opposition of war in Vietnam, but also to provide a critique of mainstream economics with its flawed ontological and epistemological understanding of the world. And so URPE's mission is to promote not just the study of radical political economic problems, to study the social problems within a radical political economic framework, but also to critique the capitalist system and all forms of exploitation and oppression. And so in that context, and very similar to AHE, we as an organization felt like it was very important to take a stand on Palestine because understanding what's happening in Gaza and Palestine, and what is happening now also helps us understand what's happening globally. So in a racial, heteropatriarchal, imperialist, capitalist system that's fostering fascist tendencies in various parts of the world, how are these forces empowered by what's unfolding in Gaza, what's unfolding in Palestine? And I'm hoping that as thinkers are revealing to us some of the intricacies and some of the analysis of Gaza and Palestine, that we can collectively also intervene in a meaningful and effective way and become capitalists and provide ground for social transformation and hopefully liberation. So I'm really, really excited to listen to Professor Ibrahim Shikaki, who is Assistant Professor of Economics at Trinity College in Hartford. He earned his PhD from the New School for Social Research and has held teaching and research positions in Palestine, Italy, and the US. Ibrahim teaches courses that revolve around using heterodox economics to study the world, but also the political economy of Palestine. His publications include a journal article on structural modeling of the Palestinian economy, a book chapter on the political economy of dependency and class formation in Palestine, and a foreign policy piece on the dangers of economic peace. So Ibrahim will speak for about 30 minutes, and then that will be followed by two discussants, Raja Khalidi, the Director General of the Palestine Economic Policy Research Institute. Raja has been the research coordinator at this institute since 2016. He previously worked at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development from 1985 to 2013, and was the coordinator of its program of assistance to the Palestinian people from 2000 to 2006. He spent his last 5 years at UNCTAD as the head of the Office of the Director of the Division of Globalization and Development Strategies, which led UNCTAD's response to the global economic crisis and its participation in the G20 process. And our other discussant, Rafeef Ziadah, is Senior Lecturer in Politics and Public Policy, King's College London, as well as a spoken word artist and human rights activist. She holds a PhD in politics from York University, Canada. Her research centers on the production of interdisciplinary scholarship that falls into three thematic areas: infrastructure and logistics, gender and feminism, race and racialization. And her recent research is broadly concerned with the political economy of maritime infrastructures and logistics, with a particular focus on the Middle East and East Africa. So welcome to the speaker, welcome to our discussants, and I will turn it over to Ibrahim.
All right, wonderful. Let me share the slides just to make sure. So everybody can see this and you can hear me okay? Perfect. So I'll start timing myself. Thank you, Ingrid and Sirisha, the Association for Heterodox Economics and URPE, Rafeef and Raja, for agreeing to participate, and for everyone taking from their time to be here today. The goal of this webinar is twofold, really. The first, in the midst of one of the most brutal attacks on the lives and future of the Palestinian people, the objective is to locate this genocidal moment in its larger historical, colonial, and political economy contexts. Second, and not unrelated, to discuss the role of heterodox economics in understanding the dynamics of economic activity in Palestine. And so to achieve these objectives in 35 minutes or so, I will start with a 5-minute introductory part on the situation today, followed by a discussion of the settler colonial context in relation to economic path dependency. Then the following theme will shed light on the economic dependency that followed the occupation in 1967, and a final 10 minutes to present the intersections between economic research in Palestine and heterodox economics. And so for many people, including myself, who have been living on Telegram channels that post on the war in Gaza for the last 4 months, we've become desensitized a little bit with regards to numbers. Still, I think it's necessary to stop for a moment and appreciate the magnitude of the current genocide happening in front of our eyes. A week ago, when I was preparing for this, Israel had used 66,000 tons of explosives on Gaza. If you're wondering what that looks like, that's the equivalent of 3 to 4 atomic bombs dropped on a tiny strip that you can see on the left-hand side of the screen. The length is 60 kilometers and the width is 6. These indiscriminate bombs completely destroyed 70,000 housing units and partially damaged 290,000. 395 schools and colleges were destroyed, 400 mosques were bombed. As a result, there were 28,176 confirmed deaths, including 12,300 children and 8,400 women. The World Health Organization documented 350 different Israeli attacks on healthcare facilities and ambulances. 27 of the total 36 hospitals in Gaza were damaged by Israeli attacks, and hundreds of thousands of Gazans are in imminent danger due to lack of resources. Tens of people have died out of cold, hunger, to the extent that people are using animal feed and water to bake bread. Needless to say, the economic ramifications have also been disastrous, including skyrocketing inflation for the little goods and produce available. And yet, some asked why we call this a genocide. My response is, what else should we call it? Now, as devastating as these numbers are, trust me, they are nothing compared to the daily images or daily stories coming from Gaza. And so I just want to provide one picture that shows the destruction of one of the tens of neighborhoods that were completely demolished. And I have a small link here. I know Ingrid is thankfully going to upload this presentation so people can click on that link to tell the story of young Hind Rajab of 5 years old. While on a completely different scale, the Israeli army has also been conducting daily raids in cities, villages, and refugee camps in the West Bank, using bulldozers, army-grade machinery, and drones. Israeli settlers have intensified their attacks in Palestinian village. At the same time, the army has tightened their presence on checkpoints and other closure mechanisms in the West Bank, making it virtually impossible to move from one area to the other. The map on the left-hand side is from UN OCHA, showing the various restrictions on movement. Worsening economic conditions are being witnessed in the West Bank, especially with the Israeli decision to halt Palestinian work in the Israeli economy, which employs a little bit less than 200,000 Palestinians. In certain cities in the northern West Bank, especially like Jenin, Tulkarem, and Nablus, data shows that the majority of firms are reporting declines in sales, capacity, and employment to unprecedented levels in the recent past. Now, as I mentioned, one of the aims of this is to present the current events in their historical context. So we will go back a little bit to the late 19th century, really, when historical Palestine was under the rule of the ailing Ottoman Empire. The population living on that land at the time was overwhelmingly Arab, both Muslims and Christian, with a small Jewish minority of 3 to 4%. Really, the start of the Jewish immigration started in the 1880s, where a number of Jews fleeing anti-Semitism, mostly in Tsarist Russia, and convinced with the newly formed Zionist ideas, immigrated to Palestine and established roughly 20 colonies. During these early immigration waves, Zionist organizations sent fact-finding missions to explore the viability of establishing a Jewish state. In one of the reports, it was noted, "The bride is beautiful, but she is already married," referring to the Arab population people. Now, sometimes I hear people strongly associating Israel with colonialism. And so if you're one or two people here who think so, I give you some quotes from Ze'ev Jabotinsky. He's a key figure in Zionist thinking and the intellectual father of the Likud party, of which Benjamin Netanyahu is part of. I'm not going to read all of the quotes, but maybe the first and the third are extremely interesting. So the first goes, "There can be no voluntary agreement between ourselves and the Palestinian Arabs, not now, nor in the prospective future. Zionism is a colonizing adventure, and therefore it stands or falls by the question of armed force." The third one is also very interesting. It goes, "My readers have a general idea of the history of colonization in other countries. I suggest that they consider all the precedents with which they are acquainted and see whether there is one solitary instance of any colonization being carried on with the consent of the native population. There is no such precedent. The native populations, civilized or uncivilized, have always stubbornly resisted the colonists. So this is from 1923, his essay that anybody can look up, The Iron Wall. I don't know about you, but that sounds pretty colonially to me. In 1917, during World War I, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration, promising the establishment of, quote, a national home for the Jewish people, and claiming that the government will use their best endeavors to facilitate achievement of this objective. Now, again, at that time of the declaration, the 700,000 Palestinian Arabs still constituted the overwhelming majority, with the two major waves of aliyahs, or European Jewish immigration, adding up to roughly 55,000 Jews. The British would double down on their support, as Article 6 of the British Mandate Charter stated that the administration would, quote, facilitate Jewish immigration, end quote, and encourage settlement by Jews on state land. Indeed, since the declaration, and particularly the imposition of a British mandate on Palestine, Jewish immigration accelerated. This, of course, would intensify further following the rise of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. The picture on the right from London reads, "You must save the lives of the Jewish people in Germany. Sign the petition for increased immigration to Palestine." The mandate would facilitate much more than immigration, however, and this is where we turn into the political economy aspect. So together with the key Zionist organizations that were operating in Palestine, that's the Jewish Colonization Association, that would later conveniently be named the Palestine Jewish Colonization Association, the Jewish National Fund, the Palestine Land Development Company, and the Foundation Fund, would really transform the economy of Palestine at that time. According to Fadl Naqib, the crux of the Jewish economy during the mandate period was built on market distortions created by these organizations. On the one hand, land prices were distorted since the Jewish National Fund was able to pay prices way above the local market price. And when the Jewish National Fund bought land, it became owned by the Jewish people of the world, effectively removing those plots from the market completely. The substantial increase in demand for land by Zionist organization steadily led to the commodification of land, which you have to keep in mind was almost foreign to Palestine at that time. Capital from donations and grants was distributed according to political considerations rather than the most profitable projects, hence only financing Jewish industries. And finally, labor in those industries did not even enter the labor market. So workers were ensured work as long as they were part of the Labor Party, and later if they were part of the General Organization of Workers in Israel, or the Histadrut at that time. As for the British mandate, particularly, it deliberately facilitated growth in Jewish industry and imposed policies that would facilitate the proletarianization of Palestinians, stripping them from their lands. So first, while agriculture taxes already existed during the Ottoman Empire, taxes under the British mandate were required in cash, driving peasants into debt and money borrowing with higher interests. Second, the first economic concessions in vital projects in Palestine, including the Ruttenberg Electricity Company, the Athlete Salt Company, that were both granted in 1922, and then the concessions for using Dead Sea minerals and establishing the Palestine Potash Company in 1929. Third, there was an extremely important part that tilted the economic aspects. And this was the issue of tariffs. The Mandate administration abolished export tariffs on Jewish manufactured goods and any import tariffs on the raw material they required, while imposing high import tariffs on final goods that might compete with Jewish industries. The opposite treatment was imposed on Arab industries. For example, high tariffs were imposed on cement and chemicals, while no tariffs were imposed on olive oil and soap, which were mainly Arab industries. Finally, fourth, and connected to that third point, the mandate applied an open door policy with regards to agricultural goods. So Palestinian farmers were unable to compete with imported crops, increasing their debt, and ultimately leading many of them to sell their lands to larger landowners. So it's not surprising then that at the time of the partition plan, more than 25 years after the imposition of the mandate, the weight of the Jewish economy became stronger than its Arab counterpart, growing from 19% of overall production to 53%. Now, this table doesn't even tell the whole story because by 1947, the Jewish share of industrial production was 89%. And then the Jewish capital investment was 88% of total capital investment in Palestine. That 1947 UN partition plan, which map you can see on the left-hand side, suggested a Jewish state on 57% of the land of Palestine, despite only forming 35% of the total population. This was clearly faced with opposition and revolt from Palestinians. The state of Israel was then declared, and Jewish militias, including the Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi, and others, committed 70 documented massacres that eventually led to the exodus of 80% of the population, or roughly 750,000 Palestinians, as well as the complete destruction of 700 plus villages. The map on the right shows the so-called green line borders that were set after the Nakba, or 1948. And so Palestinian refugees fled to the closest neighboring areas, including the West Bank and Gaza Strip, Jordan, Palestine, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon. And 20 years later, in 1967, Israel would take over the remainder part of historical Palestine, which are the West Bank and the Gaza Strip that you can see on purple on the left-hand side map. Under international law then, and this is where I'm going to move on, but under international law, those are the areas considered under Israeli occupation. So any discussion today of a Palestinian state or a Palestinian economy refers explicitly to the West Bank and Gaza Strip, including East Jerusalem, which constitute a mere 22% of historical or mandate Palestine. So the third theme comes and focuses on the economics of the West Bank and Gaza Strip under occupation, so after 1967. During that time, there was very little invested in the Palestinian territories. In terms of public investment, there was an Israeli report in 1991, the Sedan report, that stated, quote, "No priority was given to the promotion of the local entrepreneurship and business sector. Moreover, the authorities discouraged such initiatives whenever they threatened to compete in the Israeli market with existing Israeli firms." So that was clear in terms of public investment. In terms of private investment, some of the first military orders of Israel in 1967 shut down all the 30 bank branches, and other military orders slammed Palestinian employers with hefty administrative procedures, permit restrictions, to the extent that it was virtually impossible to import new machinery. That meant Palestinians were left only with the option of buying second-hand machines from Israel. As such, for the 15 years from 1970 until 1985, so really almost the first 15, 20 years of the occupation, the vast majority of growth in economic activity centered around work in Israel, not the domestic economy. In fact, the total number of workers in the domestic economy did not change from 1970 to 1985. As a result, there was a new wave of proletarianization that ensued the 1967 occupation, where self-employed Palestinians, in agriculture mostly, lost their capital, lost their land, and as Marx would say, they only had their labor to sell. So they became wage workers in the Israeli economy, the majority in the construction sector. The table that you see on the right shows some data related to that transformation. And then on the graph on the left is a double-scaled graph to visually show that correlation. So the first variable is wage labor, and the second is employment in Israel. So you can see how those both developed in tandem. This created a deep dependency on the labor market that would remain entrenched until today. The ability of the private sector to absorb labor was always in doubt, evidenced by unemployment levels hiking whenever employment opportunities in Israel waned, as the graph shows. So this graph shows the unemployment rate and the percentage of Palestinian labor in Israel. Palestinian labor served Israel in a multitude of ways, right? So first, clearly the introduction of this new pool of cheap surplus labor with low wages and low benefits curtailed wage inflation and ensured a steady profit for Israeli enterprises. But then also Palestinian workers were vulnerable to repression and unfair treatment. There was an Israeli newspaper in the 1970s that has an interesting quote where one Israeli owner is saying, "It is almost impossible to fire an Israeli worker or relocate him without his permission and without a wage increase." On the other hand, an Arab worker is exceptionally mobile, can be dismissed without notice, and moved from one place to place. They do not strike and they do not present demands, end quote. And finally, another important aspect, I believe, of labor was their utilization to quell conflict between Israeli capital and labor, right? So on the one hand, it suppresses bargaining power of Jewish labor at that time of recession, but at the same time, at times of growth, it allows for this social mobility. An added benefit for Israel, of Palestinian labor in Israel, was the creation of a substantial purchasing power for the Palestinian population. But if you combine the purchasing power with a very weak productive sector, that was a recipe for an ever-increasing trade deficit for Palestinian, as the graph shows. By the 1980s, more than 2/3 of all Palestinian trade was tied with Israel. And while the size of trade is certainly indicative of a dependency relationship in the making, the type of goods that were traded can be very telling. The majority of imports from the West Bank and Gaza Strip were light manufactured goods, while the Israeli exports to the Palestinian market were final consumer goods and durables. In fact, there was a study by the UN in 1984 that showed that 50% of Palestinian imports from Israel had previously, before the occupation, been produced internally. Now, with the establishment of the Palestinian Authority as part of the Oslo Accords, nothing really changed. Many of the dependency relationships were merely codified, and very little was given to the Palestinian Authority in terms of its control over borders, resources, and policy. On the face of it, there was that fiscal policy section that was perhaps one of the only real changes, but given the asymmetric power dynamics between the two sides, Israel continued and continues to use any fiscal transfers to the PA as a political pressure card. There were two new dependencies, however, that were created with the PA. So the first is the dependency on international aid. And for a very long time, aid would be necessary to pay the public sector wage bill, which would affect the livelihood of roughly 1/5 of the labor force. As such, very little was seen in terms of productive investment because that aid went to wages. The graph on the right shows the percentage of investment or gross fixed capital formation in buildings. That's the black part of the column. And then the non-building investment remained on average less than 20%. Equally disturbing was the creeping new dependency on private debt and credit facilities. The availability of credit by itself might not be problematic. However, as the graph on the right shows, the majority of credit was focused on trade finance, consumption goods, and cars. A couple of years ago, in 2021, employment-generating investments in agriculture and manufacturing constituted a mere 8% of total credit facilities. So it's not surprised that under the PA, the structural distortions of the occupation remained and they persisted. This is manifested on the left-hand side, showing that after the end of the Second Intifada in 2006, the contribution of trade or internal trade activities skyrocketed, while productive sectors such as manufacturing and agriculture dwindled. This internal trade sector really is another way of saying that economic activities related to small convenience shops, dekakin in Arabic, that were mostly dominated by Israeli products. So that sector constituted more than 50% of all economic establishments in the Palestinian economy. 40% of the private sector output comes from internal trade, 37% of private sector workers worked in internal trade, and around 1/4 of total credit facilities as well. So this is just another evidence of this entrenched dependency on Israel. Even when we're talking about the role of the private sector in Palestine, it is very much connected to the Israeli economy. And so it's clear that whatever avenues for international aid, whatever policies of international financial institutions or the Palestinian Authority have been unable to change this course and path dependency of the Palestinian economy for more than 100 years now, which brings me to the last section of this presentation. Much of the neoclassical literature on the Palestinian economy assumes that the integration or proximity with Israel will ultimately lead to a dispersion of positive effects on the Palestinian economy and possible dynamics of convergence. This was congruent with early Israeli work, which highlighted neoclassical factor endowment differentiation and the role of wage incentives for Palestinian workers, completely disregarding the political reality of colonization, the intentional policies that hampered economic development, and the resulting class transformation following the loss of capital of the majority of Palestinian families. Such a neoclassical framework was also devoured. This idea of convergence was devoured from any empirical proof beyond a very short transitional period of 5 to 7 years in the beginning of the occupation. But there have been, in the Palestinian context, multiple attempts to highlight the shortcomings of neoclassical economics and neoliberal policies. So my work with Ala Tartir in 2012 discusses the stages of economic policy, differentiating between using economics as a tool of resistance, such as in the first Intifada, versus this neoliberal stage of policymaking that followed the political process in the 1990s. Layla Farsakh in 2016 provides a useful categorization that helps navigate the literature in studying the Palestinian economy. And she highlights a recent, what she calls the political economy paradigm, which questions the notion itself of development, as well as the so-called state building project that was led at that time by Prime Minister Salam Fayyad, and even the necessity of using the state as our unit of analysis. Raja Khalidi argues that there's a new wave being dominated by a somewhat younger, you're not that old, Raja, somewhat younger, radical, and impatient generation of heterodox and activist scholars that departs from, indeed renounces, the preceding trend in studying the realities of Palestinian development. And more recently, Clara Capelli and Marco Missaglia look explicitly into the neoclassical economics and heterodox economics duality in economic thinking and policy making in Palestine. Now, there are not many economists who have explicitly used heterodox models within the Palestinian context. I think Ali Qadri's work is one of the few attempts to utilize both a neoclassical and a heterodox approach to study a single economic phenomena, which for Qadri was Palestinian labor in Israel. And he effectively discards this neoclassical wage incentive explanation that was long adopted by the mainstream and offers two different heterodox methods as an alternative. So he uses a dependency approach and what he calls a radical Marxian analysis. Another example would be my work on the shortcomings of growth models. I use a structureless Kolekskian model for economic growth, which takes class and stylized facts of the economy into consideration. And I conclude that whether Palestinian workers or Palestinian capitalists bear the economic burden of the occupation can have an impact on short-run growth dynamics. But then a lot of the critical work as well takes a political economy lens, putting power, class, and distribution at the forefront, including the work of the great Fadl Naqib, of course. There was a wonderful book by the Center for Development Studies, which is part of Birzeit University in 2015. The title was Critical Readings of Development Under Colonialism Towards a Political Economy of Liberation. I believe at that time it was Samia Butme, who was the director of Center Development Study. And Samia's work also in 2016 on gender and the labor market is another example, as is Wilderman and Alat Tatir's book on international aid. Neoliberalism in the Palestinian context was also dissected masterfully by Raja and Subhi Sammour in their 2011 article at the Journal for Palestine Studies, and Khalil Nakhle's book, The National Sellout of a Homeland in 2014 is another example of that. Others like Adel Samara and myself following in his footsteps try to examine that problematic aspects of convergence theory and offer alternative dependency frameworks to understand economic dynamics. I also want to mention that there have been several universities hosting critical conferences. Most notable in my mind is the University of Pavia in Italy, which hosted a conference almost entirely dedicated to the critique of neoclassical economics in terms of modeling and policy. And then Brown University Center for Middle East Studies also hosts an annual conference where the 2014 iteration was titled Political Economy and the Economy of Politics, and hosted a number of papers on the failures of neoclassical economics. Finally, many social scientists working on Palestine have pointed out the significance of alternative approaches that study class transformation. So Hilal examines the shift from petty bourgeois to wage labor in the wide-scale proletarianization process after 1967. Adam Hamiyeh sheds light on the rise of what he calls the returnee capitalists from the Gulf states. And then Jamil Hilal again in 2016 discusses the evolution of the new professional middle class after the establishment of the Palestinian Authority in 1993. Now, by all means, this list is not comprehensive, but it's meant to give a flavor of the type of work that already exists in Palestine, the critical work. It is worth noting, however, that many of these works are either written by scholars who are not trained economists or do not use the typical economic format. This is not particularly surprising. I mean, the evolution of the economics profession, especially the neoclassical strand, has culminated in the majority of work imitating some applied statistics exercise in the Palestinian context. This is at best utterly useless, and at worst, it accommodates the Israeli occupation by depoliticizing the Palestinian struggle and negating really any possible role for economic resistance or steadfastness, as these are questions considered outside the realm of economics. There is hope and relevance, I believe, in alternative approaches to economics. Regardless of how we define heterodox economics, I feel there are many themes that can relate to the Palestinian context, and I'll end on this slide and the next. But to start, uneven development, whether studied within formal models or within a broader interdisciplinary dependency framework, is extremely useful in the Palestinian context. And here I take lead from Ingrid and her definition of the dependency research project as one that utilizes a global historical approach, one that criticizes neoclassical convergence theories and stages views of development, but then dependency that theorizes on the polarizing tendencies of global capitalism and focuses on structures of production as opposed to simply observing this exchange sphere. One tenet that I think is very important that Ingrid talks about is the focus on specific constraints by peripheral economies, which can be political, colonial, and post-colonial. The second is class analysis, and I think that can be extremely informative in the Palestinian context. Now, there is more and more work done on the impact of the Israeli occupation, but less work done on internal distribution between Palestinians, understandably so. But I think there's a lot more that can be done on that aspect, on the role of functional distribution of income, particularly. First, in terms of the bargaining power of Palestinian labor vis-a-vis Palestinian capital, vis-a-vis Israeli capital, but also in terms of its impact on a possible wage versus profit-led regimes, or if Paulo dos Santos is here, he'd want me to say consumption versus investment-led regimes. The third, I feel there's a strong gap in terms of critical feminist economics. And so I believe examining that gendered nature of economic inequality is of a great importance. This can be related to the issue of time use and the care economy, which is very important, the wage gap, gender-sensitive budgets, and particularly this critical view of the participation of women in the labor force. Palestine has actually one of the lowest female participation rates in the world, probably the low 10% of something, with 18.6% only in terms of female labor participation. Fourth, and I think this is relevant for many developing countries, but especially in Palestine, I feel the idea of looking at the how much the macroeconomic variables that we use today are relevant is to a point that a lot of the standard criteria is almost useless. Last summer, I met the wonderful Ndongo Sila at that summer school in Bard. We were both lecturing, and I was telling him about how important it is to discuss the role of, you know, the macroeconomic variables in the labor force. He replied, Ibrahim, I wrote about that for the ILO 10 years ago in 2013, and he sent me his paper. But I do believe that there's a lot to be done there. I know Ahmed Tunak and Anwar Sheikh had the Measuring the Wealth of Nations book. Ingrid as well had the article on measuring standards, measurement standards for GDP as well. And then finally, I do have to mention something that I'm particularly interested in, as I am in many of these, which are structural and growth models in the Kaletskian and structuralist traditions. Amitabh Dutt has his wonderful book from 1990s. And recently I read an article by Stockhammer on the ingredients for post-Keynesian growth models in periphery economies. Of course, there are other methods that are used both in the mainstream and heterodox that I think are relevant. There was a recent article by Gennaro Zesa using stock flow consistent models, looking at the north and south of Italy, which I think is interesting and can be implemented in the Palestinian context. Myself and Daniel Yunisi operate an agent-based model focusing on Anwar Sheikh's real competition, and there are other aspects as well. And so to wrap up, I promise, Ingrid, after maybe hitting you with 50 different names, both from the heterodox world and the Palestinian context, which is absolutely intentional. My main message to you is that there are very many avenues for cooperation that can be exploited by this academic community. A lot of times when I'm giving lectures, there's this question of what we can do. Well, you can do a lot of things, and the heterodox scholar community can do a lot of things, including partnerships with Palestinian colleges and universities, PhD scholarships for Palestinian students, inviting Palestinian speakers as visiting scholars and faculty, special issues for journals, organizing conferences on the Palestinian economy, or arranging visits for faculty to visit Palestine and meet scholars and activists. And if your justification is that you don't know any Palestinians, my email is on the first and the last slide here. And so you can email me and I can put you in touch with people from colleges, activists, institutions, research centers, where to get the best hummus and falafel and knafe. You have no excuse after today. So thank you so much for bearing with the 36 minutes that I've been speaking. I tried to put a lot here and I still had to brush over some points, but I'm hoping that there's going to be sufficient discussion and Q&A to kind of put a little bit more meat on these skeleton ideas. Thank you so much.
Amazing, thank you. That was really good timekeeping and a lot of stuff for discussion. So let's pass it on to Raja Khalidi, our first discussant. Yeah, about 10 minutes.
Hi. Good evening. Thanks very much to HE and URPE and of course Brahim. I'll try to be brief. In fact, I mean, I really there's so much we can talk about current economic issues. So I will leave that to what you already heard in brief from Brahim and Q&A if you wish. I mean, that's a separate subject. I'm more interested, to be honest, in commenting on especially the third section of Brahim's presentation, because his historical analysis and analysis of the structural development problematique that is something that I've been studying since before he started studying it, let's say. And what he said about the new generation, certainly, I won't say I've lived to regret writing that, but it's a huge. There's a whole school now of people working like Brahim in let's say a heterodox treatments of the Palestinian economy, and from including even some kids coming out of the educational system here because they've read stuff by that's been produced over, I would say, particularly over the last decade. And before that, there was very little beyond the one or two sources that Brahim mentioned. So I'd like to focus on the question more of heterodoxy in Palestine, economic heterodoxy in Palestine, and where can we find it? This is my, and I think this is important for Brahim's own interest in trying to set up a network of heterodox Palestinian economists and economic practitioners. And I think there's a big problem, because it's not going to be easy for anybody. It's not easy to really find where those people and those schools of thought may be found. If we look at sort of four sectors, academia, government and politics, capital, business, and labor/civil society. In each of those areas, you have problems about, there's a reason that there are very few Palestinian examples of the sort of heterodoxy that Brahim is referring to. And that's not necessarily, because of the lack of Marxist economists or non-neoclassical economists. It's because of also the nature, and we start with academia, the nature of the people who've been teaching economics in Palestine for the last 30 years. I mean, the first generation of economists that I remember working with in the early 1990s had been, freshly educated in the United States, mainly very neoclassical. That's all they knew. And if you ask those people today, even, what do you think of Palestinian economic heterodoxy? They won't even know what we're talking about, what heterodox economics are. So these people were very influential in forming the first generation, including, and Brahim will tell you, he studied to a great extent at the hands of those sorts of people who had been formed in very orthodox economics. So it's only, in the last 10 years, 15 years, that because of various reasons, partly because of people going, beyond that, mainly because of that, but that you now have a younger, and it is a younger generation of economists who, mainly political economics, but it's not only economists, it's a lot of people now do political economy who are not necessarily economists, and there's an issue there, but anyhow, we'll talk about that separately. So there is the problem of academia, and it remains a problem because you don't have there is no anchor in Palestine like there is in pretty much every country. You'll find there's a new school somewhere in every country. There's no new school in Palestine. There have been attempts to establish progressive liberal arts programs in Bard and in Pirzay, and those are perhaps nuclei for something, but there is no anchor. So therefore, the individuals, the Shikakis, the Khalidis, the Qadris, the Hanis, who've worked with heterodox, thinking, guiding them, really don't have a home. Mass is part of that academia, but mass under, I would like to believe under my, guidance has certainly taken on a lot more heterodox type approaches to the things we do. But then, of course, policy doesn't allow for much heterodoxy. So you have to try and very, creatively use heterodox and open thinking, but in the end, deliver results that fit a certain political paradigm. So academia is one problem. Politics and the government are even worse, more problematic problem because they're captive to donor thinking and agendas. To the extent that, a concept like resilience, which the Palestinians almost, invented in the political sense and in the economic sense in the 80s and the 70s and the 80s. And then we keeps coming back. Sumud keeps coming back. Every difficult period we have Sumud, and resilience becomes. So it had come to the point that it had been appropriated by the World Bank last year in launching water and infrastructure projects, which the World Bank has been doing for 50 years. Never doing it for resilience, but because it's catchy and because it fits the Palestinian and their own frame. So therefore you have a government at this moment that was planning for 6 years of resilience. So you become captive to that sort of process to the extent that government doesn't think anymore. So heterodoxy is, problematic for the politicians, and this includes the political, even the left parties. The best the left can come up with is the term social justice. That's about it. Class analysis is not something that they, would willingly entertain. Now, capital, you have to look at, I think realistically, and we have a national bourgeoisie, and that national bourgeoisie is patriotic in its general record, and but it's not homogeneous. It's a heterogeneous class. It's you have a expatriate big capital, let's say, which is sort of footloose and is not necessarily mainly based here. Necessarily, its main focus is in the Gulf or wherever, and Adam has worked extensively on that. And you have a local homegrown capitalist class, which is perhaps even in some ways more patriotic because they're more stuck here, and their future is here and only here, and they're more down on the ground doing things. And anyhow, so there's fertile ground in capital for heterodoxy given the circumstances, but it needs political leadership that doesn't exist. So what I'm saying is that the ideas of import substitution as a necessary strategy in this post-war scenario will find wide buy-in in a way that it couldn't 5 years ago. And as for labor, now labor is problematic because it's not organized, it's not mobilized. It's very vaguely sort of coalesces, let's say, in very odd ways sometimes around issues. So the social security, the attempt to try and make a proper social security system 5 years ago, and then again last year, was met fiercely, very oddly, by labor, by people claiming to be representatives of the workers. Now they might have been Islamist, Hizb Tahrir, or left opponents of the PA, representatives of labor, but labor is a very conflicted, labor. When we talk about dependency, if you want to blame anybody for dependency, okay, you can blame capital for pushing people off the land, but you cannot, the working class is not innocent, let's say, totally in that respect. I mean, they have agency in that as well. Second point I wanted to say, I have another 4 or 5 minutes, yeah. Second point I wanted to mention was something that was actually mentioned by Dr. Azmi Bshara recently at a lecture I attended in Doha, and he was talking about this moment, historical moment, and this critical juncture, which those of you who are probably better informed in social history, social theory, know that at a critical juncture of the sort that we are now facing in Palestine and Israel, agency can overwhelm and overcome the structures that bind us and that have, that lock in power, configurations of power. Now, agency in the Palestine, so we've seen that before. It's not the first time, but like 2021 was a moment of that sort. But not perhaps, it showed the potential, but it didn't go far. This moment has gone far, whether we like it or not. And we know that it's created a popular moment in Palestine. And that will apply to the economy and what is decided to be done about the economy. So, obvious decisions that should have been made before can now be made more effectively. Be it, for example, importing new cars has been banned because there's, the market is full of unsold, still new cars. And so this is a logical, rational war economy type measure to take. So I'm saying that there is now room, therefore, for heterodox solutions that perhaps did not exist 4 months ago. But, as we also know, the power relations, geostrategic power, relations regarding the PA, the PLO, Hamas, Israel, as well as capitalist relations, will ultimately determine whether the structures recreate or reproduce in another form of domination of agency. The final quick comments are on some of Brahim's very interesting and I think very useful indeed heterodox themes. And I'll just say very briefly that we've, either I or Mass or others of those that Brahim referred to have worked on some of these issues. I mean, I think, and not only that we have worked on, but I think, again, this is now a moment where there is an openness to looking at issues that were out of the question before, even though in some ways the prospects for some of these issues is more difficult. I mean, uneven development and dependency analysis is now, what more unevenness can you have, and what greater challenge of liberating yourself from colonial dependency can you have than the Palestinian economy has today? And so, will our solutions be up to the level of those sort of challenges? I don't know, but I mean, we're working on trying to think of things like that in that way. Class analysis for me was something that was increasingly, and will, I believe, return to be, maybe not for the next year or two, but I think given the position, the state at which, or where the Palestinian National Project had reached or had failed to reach in the past years, the imperative for postponing progress on social and economic rights, the imperative was weakening, and hence the imperative for in fact struggling for those issues was increasingly evident to me, and I think to citizenry in a sense, because there's no national liberation, so let's do something about our social security, our education services, our responsiveness and accountability of government and all of that. So that was bringing the issue of class conflict, if you wish, into focus. The social security campaign I mentioned was a very interesting example, provided a lot of evidence for the way capital was opposing and trying to mobilize itself, but also the working class, unfortunately. Anyhow, so there's another area which we've just done a study on, Ibrahim, and you should check it out. It hasn't yet been published, but it's about inequality in Palestine. But it's not so much about income inequality, though I think a lot of work can be done and should be done, needs to be done on that, because we don't know. It's a big black hole. But we know that there's huge and alarming inequality, but it's not quite clear from the data and the financial system and the formal economy and how it works where that wealth is all coming from. And one assumes land and other rentier type activities. But anyhow, we've just done something at Mass on inequality in terms of access to services. So how, it's sort of about multi-dimensional inequality, if you wish. And finally, the feminist economics as well. And this is something which, I think heterodox economics needs to be, in Palestine at least, needs to be more on its toes, let's say, to claim a bit that agenda. and take it away from liberal and neoliberal economics, if you wish, and ground it a bit more in not only in the question of empowerment of women in the economy, but in the Palestinian context, I think there's more to the role to empowerment of women than in the economy than just the economic aspect, because of the social role, because of the political role. Anyhow, so those themes definitely. But I'll go back and conclude just by saying there is no home in Palestine for heterodox economics. Even Mass cannot claim to be that place, and that's something that you in academic institutions can promote by the sort of exchanges and interactions that Brahim mentioned at the end of his statement. Voila, I'm good. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raja, for those comments. I'm sure, with the presentation and your comments, people are probably formulating a lot of questions. I'd like to invite Rafeef Ziadah to offer her comments, and, hopefully we can, 10 minutes or so, and then we have about 15 minutes for conversation with the audience.
The kind invitation to be in this conversation. I should start by saying I feel this is an urgent conversation, although it seems academic, but I think the situation in Gaza and all the horrors we have seen actually mean that heterodox economics really needs to step up, and we really need better analysis with urgency. My esteemed colleagues spoke about heterodox economics in Palestine. I want to flip this slightly and speak about the role of heterodox economics externally, and the fact I have lived with a long frustration now that heterodox economists internationally tend to bracket Palestine and the Middle East. They tend to bracket it as the place where there is conflict, so there's analysis of conflict, but you cannot really have economic analysis. And this has really actually hurt the production in terms of what Palestine has become. There has been a separation steadily between the political and the economic. So when people speak about the Oslo peace process, for example, there is a large discussion, and Oslo itself was built on this idea that you can have a political track that is separate from the economic track, and that you would first resolve problems that were political, and then you move on to economics, or that you could have a neoclassical economic trend, which is essentially what the Palestinian Authority political and the economic back together. Separate streams that we can talk about as if you can have one track and not the other. Palestinian economists have done this for quite some time. They have analyzed the economy as a captive economy. There has been good production. I agree with Raja fully that there isn't a mass center of heterodox economics, but there have been voices that have put forward this analysis, including my colleagues on the call, of course. But internationally, this hasn't really penetrated. And I think there's a role to really breaking this division that occurred over the years of the Oslo Accords between separating political and economic, where the Paris Protocol is hardly spoken about, the economic dependency that, yes, was forged historically, but also intensified under the Paris Protocols, those structures of the political economy of Palestine that have made Palestine a dependency and a captive economy. Well before October 7th, those structures had existed, destroying and de-developing the Palestinian economy steadily. I also come to this question not just as a political economist, but as a labor organizer, both within Palestine, but externally as well. So I'm really interested in important, not just for Palestinian political economists, but externally as well, in starting to deal with Palestine as heterodox economists in a more serious way. And the first one I'll start with is the question of geography, because I still feel that even when we speak about Palestine and analyze Israel as a settler colonial project, we tend to forget that the majority of Palestinians are actually refugees outside of occupied Palestine. As a matter of fact, we tend to focus just on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Now, as a refugee from Lebanon myself, I feel like this actually cements the division of the Oslo Accords and the fragmentation of the Palestinian people. I know it's very difficult, of course, to have analysis that combines the fragmentation of Palestinians, and this would include Palestinian citizens of Israel as well. But I think the settler colonial analytic has to force us to treat heterodox economics and to treat the Palestinian entity and Palestinian labor on multiple scales. And this is something very important we can take from critical geography. Heterodox economics can really integrate the concept of scale from who are refugees externally, Palestinian capital in the diaspora, Palestinian labor in the diaspora, together with how Palestinian labor is functioning within the Green Line and outside the Green Line. To give you a very brief example, the construction sector, for example, it's very difficult to understand the construction sector by looking just at the West Bank and Gaza without seeing how the intermediary class that happens on the Israeli side of this also functions. What happens to Palestinian citizens of Israel and their role in the construction sector as well. I'm not saying that every single economic paper has to take every geography of Palestine, but I think heterodox economics and using the concept of scale can really push us to understand Palestinians in all of their geographies and the fragmentation of Palestinians across geographies. The other thing I wanted to open up the door around was this question of labor and class differentiation within the occupied territories, but also among Palestinians more broadly. And here, I think Ibrahim is absolutely correct that we need much, much more analysis on class differentiation and how it's deepening within Palestinian society. I really noted this when we were on a paper around labor under COVID-19 and what was happening with labor conditions during COVID-19 across multiple sectors, across agriculture, health, education, and construction. And you could really see the differentiation between what is happening at that very micro level within the sectors, but also the different types of jobs within each sector. There is certainly an entrenched class differentiation that is deepening, but often when we speak about Palestinian political economy, it's done from a macro level rather than at that micro level of labor. And I think heterodox economics, again, can really give us so much in terms of how we can analyze class differentiation and how we can analyze labor movements. Already so many names I see on this call are spectacular academics who write about these issues, but tend not to write about them in the context of Palestine or to completely ignore them when it comes to Palestine. So in some ways, I just want to make a plea to heterodox economists to actually take their own training in heterodox economy seriously when it comes to Palestine, and I would say even to the Middle East more broadly. And this, for me, very much links to the very much dominated by female labor. And the fact that some of the largest strikes we have had in the past few years have been around teacher strikes, but also some of the most interesting labor organizing has happened among nursery teachers. Now, of course, this has to do with changes in the structure of the Palestinian political economy itself. Many households cannot survive on a single income right now, which means more women enter the market, but also the geographic fragmentation of the West Bank and Gaza means that many women have to leave their homes, leave their villages in order to work in cities as caretakers. We have had a few papers discussing this, but not too many that are talking about the actual social reproduction and how that is shifting in Palestine, but also how some of the most, I think, incredible labor organizing is actually coming from women in these sectors. And again, this goes to that question of the micro and the macro and scale, and not just looking at the Palestinian economy from its heights, but actually what's happening at that very micro level and how it's changing. Role here for the place of social reproduction, how social reproduction has been analyzed by feminist political economists, and really bringing that work into Palestine in a serious way, not just producing the word, but actually looking technically at what is happening and what are the changes taking place. A heterodox political economy perspective can really also flip the question of Palestine away from a methodological nationalism of simply what happens inside the occupied territories to broader issues of militarism and logistics and how those function. I work on infrastructures and logistics, so I'm a bit obsessed with logistics chains. But since this latest assault on Gaza, I've been working extensively with trade unions in Palestine and internationally on tracing the supply chain of arms to Israel, trying in any way to break that chain of arms, working with dock worker unions, for example, so they can stop if there are shipments of goods to Israel, if there are shipments of military goods in particular, that they can be stopped. There are precedents in some of these unions. Some of it was around, of course, but tracing that supply chain and that military equipment in particular is work that heterodox economists can really sink their teeth into. We have a lot of this work around US militarism separately. We had it around the war on Iraq. But when it comes to Palestine, there's a lot of books that are about the Israeli military-industrial complex, but not those supply chains and how they operate. And who better than heterodox political economists to really start to talk about these supply chains, how they function, what are their roots, and how we can also stop them and what labor organizing can happen. So in some ways, this is also a plea for us not to think that a heterodox political economy of Palestine is just about the internal dynamics of the Palestinian economy. That would be really doing ourselves a disservice. It's also about taking a regional and an international lens to see how those supply chains operate, how militarism is operating. And in this, heterodox economists have a lot to give us, and we have a lot to learn. If we start to open up to the idea of taking up Palestine as a heterodox economics question, not just for Palestinian economists to capture. Palestinian economists have done the heavy lifting. For years now, they have analyzed active economy. I think to trace how their own states are supporting the settler colonial project. It's not just up to Palestinian political economists to do all the heavy lifting. I think internationally, if we flip this equation, there's a lot of work to be done. I get in many conversations with colleagues of mine who are into decolonizing economics, and who are into heterodox economics. And I ask them many questions about the Middle East or Palestine, and the conversation stops. I think what's happening in Gaza today really needs to push all of us to use all the tools that we have. If heterodox economics isn't just simply another academic discipline, if it's actually about changing the world, then let's use it as a tool in that way, not just simply for academic papers, but to actually help struggles that are on the ground, whether they're labor struggles or anti-militarist struggles. I think the things Ibrahim is pointing to his paper are real openings for Palestinian and non-Palestinian economists to take on. And I hope we can continue this conversation. It doesn't have to be a one-off, and we just need to make it deeper and better every time we have it. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all three of you for really, really amazing interventions and really important pleas and challenges to the heterodox community in terms of scholarship and activism and the way we work. So we haven't been that good at keeping time, so we don't have that much time for the Q&A unless, I don't know if the speakers will be willing to stay like a few minutes over. I'm not sure, but so what we were thinking of doing is to open up for questions and then take the questions that are there or the ones we have time for, and then we give the word back to all the panelists, and that will be the round. I just remembered that I said I would turn the recording off before the Q&A, so I'll do that right now.